You were told holiness floats above accounts. Bells ring, bowls shine, and money stays politely off stage, as if banknotes evaporate on contact with saffron. That is the postcard. Here is the room, a floor plan of gratitude with arrows that always point up the sponsorship ladder. A doctrine that dares the self to vanish, but never dares a benefactor to blush. Tonight, I am not hunting scandal. I am mapping an atmosphere. I want you to feel the oxygen source in the teachings you love, the warm breath of patrons and patrons' patrons, how the exhalations of wealth become the trade winds that steer scriptures, translations, lineages, and what counts as mature. Stay, and you will get a word you won't be offered in the brochure, Cartography. We will hold up donor rosters like star charts and watch constellations of preference harden into theology. We will see why certain sutras keep being anthologized and others left untranslated. Why ascetic ferocity becomes gentle wellness. Why emptiness becomes an ergonomic attitude. Why renunciation gets rebranded as minimalism compatible with glass offices and quarterly reviews. No conspiracy is needed. Only the slow gravity of gratitude, the soft tug that turns a bell curve of options into a narrow hallway of acceptable radiance. Every tradition insists that the bowl symbolizes dependence. Almost none admit the second half. Dependence selects doctrine. Not crudely, no envelopes stuffed with notes that say, preach this. Subtly, through boards, gala tables, speaker circuits, retreat scholarships, building campaigns, endowments with value statements that read like prayers to the market. The money is not evil. The denial is. When denial hardens, sensitivity becomes self-censorship and courage becomes a tone issue. This is not the right time, says the smiling committee, as another heresy, which is to say, another truth with teeth, is shepherded to the cloakroom to wait for a season that never arrives. Consider the phenomenon of orthodoxy by logistics. What looks like harmony is sometimes merely what can be insured, live streamed, and fundraised without friction. Austerity becomes a staging choice rather than a demand. Lineage becomes a logo rather than a wound. Compassion becomes an aesthetic that converts well with premium seating. You do not notice the shift because the language remains exquisite and the halls smell like sandalwood. But the angle of refusal, Dharma's ancient taste for cutting through the clotted fat of comfort, has been replaced by an ethos more compatible with receipts. Do no harm is interpreted as do not disturb the donor. Suffering is acknowledged as long as its causes are arranged out of frame. What is betrayed in this choreography is not only doctrine, but risk. Risk is the mother tongue of awakening. Teachers once risked patrons by telling the truth about power. Now teachers risk students by withholding the truth about patrons. The silence isn't noisy, it is efficient. It arrives as editorial decisions, programming themes, the gentle bias toward universal teachings, whose universality just happens to rhyme with what the board can applaud without calling their accountant. If you recognize this atmosphere, you have already started to breathe differently. This talk will not offer reform. It will offer recognition, the kind that cannot be unseen. After that, you will hear a new undertone in the quotes you post and the halls you enter. You will hear where the sentence bows, to whom the bow is addressed, and how much the bow costs. And at the end, when I give you a single line to carry into the next gala, you will not need to shout it. You will simply know whether the room can survive it. 5. Doctrines are not written only in manuscripts. They are written in seating charts. The cartographers of reverence are not merely scholars and elders. They are development officers, foundation program managers, alumni patrons, hospitality volunteers who know who gave what and what must therefore remain unsaid. This is not crass manipulation. It is the more elegant alchemy by which preference becomes cosmology. Repeated choices, consistently funded, harden into the silhouette of what is thinkable. Begin with the gentle gravity of restricted gifts. A donor funds mindfulness for leaders, not renunciation for landlords. Another funds trauma-informed compassion, not politics-informed karma. Over time, the library thickens in one direction, the syllabi tilt, the archive fills with interpretations that carry a perfume donors enjoy. The tradition, grateful and exhausted, calls this evolution. But evolution toward what? Toward what is repeatedly underwritten. The map of giving becomes the map of the sacred, and the edges of that map are called divisive, advanced, or not our focus at this time. Translation choices carry the same fingerprints. Which commentaries are rendered into the lingua franca of commerce and which remain in footnotes no one funds? Which terms receive a velvet gloss, shala as values, dukkha as stress, sangha as community building, and which keep their sharpness long enough to break skin? Think of the printer's devil. A tiny shift in font changes the authority of a page. The donor's shadow is that devil. It prefers cushions to thorns and will pay for it. The cost is borne in a slow narrowing of astonishment, the domestication of shock. Boards approve themes, interfaith dialogue, mindful leadership, ancient wisdom for modern life. Notice what never becomes a theme: failure of the rich to be saved by their giving, the poverty of institutions that hoard endowments while preaching emptiness. Such topics are said to be too political, as if politics were not already immanent in who gets to define too. The result is a curated serenity, real enough to help many, sanitized enough to neuter critique, profitable enough to renew the campaign next spring. There is a more intimate cartography, who gets handed the microphone and who is thanked in the kitchen. Patronage today is often reputational rather than feudal, but the consequence is similar. Voices whose tones harmonize with donor expectations become clear, while voices that carry the scrapes of dispossession become angry, trauma forward, or not quite aligned with our brand. Slowly, the doctrine speaks with the smoothest available throat. The jagged syllables of the poor are transcribed into grants, then into programs that alchemize desperation into glossy narratives of resilience. Doctrine as trauma management content sells better than doctrine as class analysis. Donors nod along because it does not ask them to change their portfolios. Why call this cosmology? Because a cosmology is not only a story of stars, it is a story of what stories can be told at all. When an institution learns which sentences open wallets and which sentences close doors, the sky of possible speech contracts. Soon, ultimate truth must be communicated in the grammar of gala brochures. The emptiness that once stripped kings is recast as an inner spaciousness, compatible with stewardship of a seven-figure fund. The Buddha who begged becomes the Buddha who budgets. Do not mistake this for a denunciation of giving. To give is to say, I want this world to continue. The question is, which world? When giving becomes cartography, it is honest to admit that the map you love is also the map you fund. Admit it, and at least we can stop pretending that the compass points north by itself. No money touches the Sangha. The sentence comes wrapped in a nimbus. It sounds like glass. In many houses, it is also an anxiety management system, a way to keep the symbol of purity intact by pushing impurity off stage. The bowl remains stainless because invisible hands scrub the ledger. The ledger remains invisible because the bowl must look like a miracle. The doctrine that grows inside this stagecraft is gentle, abstract, and deniable. It has a sheen that reads as sanctity and a silence that functions as policy. Purity rhetoric is a solvent. It dissolves inquiry about budgets by spiritualizing them into karmic flows. It dissolves questions about labor by baptizing them as service. It even dissolves the rage of the exploited by sanctifying exhaustion as devotion under conditions. If you wish to see how doctrine bends under the weight of money, watch how often words like sacred trust, lineage fidelity, tradition, and inviolable vows are deployed as a dam against mere bookkeeping. The more immutable the language, the more likely the flows behind it are mutable, negotiated, and precarious. From purity, drift toward respectability. Clean robes, clean books, clean smiles. Respectability is not evil. It is simply sticky. It accretes around boardrooms and cameras. It teaches doctrine to speak in a register that reassures rather than reorients. Sermons adopt a somehow always relevant universality, the theological equivalent of business casual. Nothing clashes, nothing rips, nothing stains. Emptiness is narrativized as openness to perspectives, suffering as stress, compassion as kindness, initiatives. The names of the dead drop out. The names of the funders remain politely unspoken, but decisively implied. Observe the paradox. Institutions that loudly disavow politics become political through their avoidance. They adopt the ruling class's favorite metaphysics. Problems are psychological, causes are impolite. A doctrine once designed to canoe through the rapids of oppression becomes whitewater decor at a hotel where the wealthy learn to breathe with better posture. The canonical courage to name Mara in the throne is replaced by a chaplaincy that blesses the throne with neutral adjectives. This is the exact spot where doctrine mutates. It loses its taste for naming power and becomes refined at naming moods. It stops severing illusions at the joint and begins sanding them so they bother less. A soft, solvent Buddhism emerges, compatible with philanthropy's needs. Be beautiful, be consoling, be available. The price is bite. The gain is access. The trade is rarely spoken because to say it would puncture the balloon, and balloons are how galas float. Yet we are not children. We can hold two truths without swallowing either whole. Purity is a real aspiration. Laundering is a real practice. When language of the first is used to mask the second, doctrine becomes an alibi, and an alibi is the only theology that never requires confession. We pretend the camera is a witness. In institutions dependent on donors, the camera becomes a teacher. It instructs doctrine on how to be visible without scaring money. It grades tones, moderates metaphors, trims edges. Before long, the grammar of recorded speech reshapes the metaphysics of the room. Emptiness must be speakable in 10 minutes. Anger must be interpretable as weather. And liberation must resemble a lifestyle change that looks good under soft boxes. The ontology that emerges is not false, it is televisable. Optics crave continuity. Donors like to see what they saw last time, slightly improved. Continuity produces aesthetic doctrine. Repetition with tiny variations becomes proof of depth. Teachers learn to circulate a canon of safe parables and safe provocations, each rehearsed to trigger applause without questions about property and wage. Interdependence is permitted so long as the interdependence of capital and doctrine is never named. Compassion is foregrounded so long as the compassion is directed at the anxieties of upward classes. Non-attachment is praised so long as non-attachment to revenue is never attempted. Under optics, silence changes species. In the old texts, silence ripened insight. In donor-shaped institutions, silence ripens brand safety. One does not speak the names that drain the room of warmth. The refusal is couched as skillful means, and sometimes it is. Often it is the quiet arithmetic of survival, but arithmetic repeated becomes metaphysics. We begin to believe that the cosmos itself avoids conflict the way a board avoids a scandal. Optics also select faces. The camera prefers smoothness. Doctrine that survives often arrives through mouths that move like silk. The rough, the halting, the furious, the unphotogenic, their metaphysics suffocate for lack of lens. Over time, the canon acquires a tone that sounds like serenity but functions like upholstery. We expect teachings to cushion. If they prick, we call the pricking harsh rather than true. The board nods because harmony reads as solvency. What dies is gravitas, not pomp, but the heaviness of unpurchased speech. Gravitas requires the willingness to lose a room. Institutions that cannot afford to lose a room will slowly edit away the teachers who can afford to lose a room. Soon it is not Mara who is cast out, but anyone who resembles him enough to make donors uncomfortable. The devil is not in the doctrine. The devil is in the donor list. Not because donors are devils, but because lists make tempos, and tempos become hymns. Lineage once meant a human being stood for you before death, and for death before you. Now lineage also means a mark, a brand, a body of proprietary translations, a licensing regime that decides who may quote, record, distribute. Intellectual property is not inherently hostile to truth. It is inhospitable to common inheritance. And common inheritance is the natural habitat of Dharma. When doctrine becomes a portfolio, permission becomes metaphysics. Observe how the metaphysical terms twist under corporate pressure. Transmission becomes certification, vow becomes terms of service, transgression becomes infringement, the rhetoric of protection, safeguarding purity, slides into the rhetoric of gatekeeping, maintaining standards. Somewhere between those parentheses stand the donors who underwrite the lawyers. What do they fund? Security. What does security require? Control. What does control ask doctrine to become? Predictable. What is predictability's favorite theology? Respectability. Publishing is the liturgy of this new clergy. What gets printed, subtitled, SEO'd, merchandised, memorialized in coffee table tomes? Whose faces travel on the covers, and whose names fill the acknowledgments rather than the byline? The doctrine that can be owned becomes the doctrine that is worth owning, and therefore the doctrine that must be taught to ensure the ownership retains meaning. Meanwhile, the old dangerous freedom, say it in the marketplace and risk your life, is replaced by say it in the brochure and risk your edge. An irony worth savoring. Traditions that proclaim the unreality of the self weaponize authentic voice as IP. The world is not wrong to laugh. Laughter, too, is a metaphysical event. It reveals a contradiction too large to step around. A church of no self that nonetheless signs its name with a trademark. The justifications are articulate and sometimes true, guarding against dilution, misrepresentation, harm. But the effect is inevitable. The center of gravity slides from liberation to licensing. When licensing wins, students learn to ask the wrong question. Is this allowed rather than is this true? Allowed speech fills halls with quiet. True speech risks halls with heat. Donor ecologies prefer cool rooms. And so the climate of doctrine adjusts to please the thermostat whose name is endowment. Saffron capital is not only private philanthropy. It is geopolitical weather, exiled communities, state-aligned cultural funds, diaspora wealth, tourism ministries. Each circulates money with a cent. The cent clings to what is pronounceable without incident at consulates and border posts. It clings to what can be displayed to dignitaries without a translator sighing. Where the state smiles, doctrine smiles. Where the state frowns, doctrine goes mum. In diasporas, dependence is double. Monasteries lean on emigre merchants who want continuity and on Western patrons who want universality. Continuity prefers piety, universality prefers therapy. Between piety and therapy, the sharp political teeth of doctrine are ground down into safe aphorisms about kindness across cultures. The monks survive. The donors feel cultured. The critique sleeps in a tongue no one funds to subtitle. National projects alter metaphysics by altering scale. Grand stupas, museums, world Buddhist forums, cross-border festivals. These demand scripts that offend no one with a badge. Emptiness becomes the perfect theology. It says nothing actionable and so can be invoked by all parties. Karma becomes etiquette. Nirvana becomes cultural heritage. In such spaces, even silence is stagecraft. It reads as profundity while functioning as neutrality theater. Meanwhile, the poor keep building small altars in kitchens. Their doctrine remains local, raw, transactional with fate. Help me bury my mother. Help my son stop drinking. Help me sleep without ghosts. No donor map charts this faith, and so it rarely informs the canon of printable profundity. Yet it is here that Buddhism remains most intellectually violent against despair, not by consoling it, but by naming its conditions without asking permission. Money's color changes doctrine's accent. Capital from luxury economies likes liberation as a cent. Capital from wounded nations likes liberation as a flag. Capital from tech likes liberation as cognitive flexibility. Each accent trains teachers to adjust vowels. Over time, a shared Esperanto of uplift emerges, and with it a theism without a god, progress. Progress promises that enough grants, enough dialogues, enough symposiums will make the wheel lighter. The wheel does not care, it rolls over rhetoric. It asks the question donors avoid: when are we willing to be poor for the truth? Compassion is the easiest doctrine to sell and the easiest to defang. Donor ecologies adore compassion because it looks like peace. What they fear is compassion's sibling, truth aimed at causes. Under Saffron capital, compassion is curated into manners, soft voices, inclusive platitudes, a hospitality that can host everyone except conflict. The aesthetic is unmistakable, tear-friendly lighting, stories of healing that end before the question of rent, reconciliation panels whose final prayer is a sponsorship acknowledgement. Philosophically, this is devastating. It trains metaphysics to operate like perfume, to hover as an aura rather than to bind as an argument. The old dangerous claims, no self, dependent arising, impermanence, are retained as sculptural motifs, admired for their lines and congratulated for their openness. Their original violence, a violence against ownership, against certainty, against the consolation of status, is domesticated into mindsets. A mindset is a doctrine declawed. It doesn't demand, it suggests, it doesn't cost, it curates. In such rooms, saints are made of glass. They stand, they glow, they do not bleed. Students learn reverence as a posture, not as a wager. The wager would be tell the truth where it is unwelcome and let consequences do their untidy work. But under the optics of generosity, consequences are liabilities. Liability is the secret god of the gilded hall, and doctrine becomes its liturgy. The sermon bows to risk management, the ritual bows to public relations. Everyone breathes easier, nobody wakens. The aesthetic of safe compassion produces a new vice that looks like patience, endless deferral. This isn't the forum. The work is happening behind the scenes. We're building relationships. Translation. We are building a future in which everything that could have been said has aged out of urgency. Deferral becomes a metaphysical stance. The universe is patient, therefore we need not be brave. And yet compassion with teeth is still possible in a billionaire's century. It simply cannot be sold as an amenity. It must arrive as an affront carried by love. The affront is this: the person who funds the cushion does not fund the truth. The truth funds itself in the currency of losses willingly taken. Anything else is decor. I have not asked you to hate donors. I have asked you to hear the doctrine that money whispers when microphones are off. The whisper is modest and imperial at once. Be beautiful, be consoling, be compatible. Against that whisper, the Dharma once sharpened a blade. It severed ownership at the root, mocked the consolations of rank, made beggars of princes and princes of beggars by asking both to kneel to what does not buy. If the blade has dulled, it is not because emperors ceased. It is because benefactors were crowned with a softer name, and the crown was permitted to touch the altar. A tradition that cannot bite the hand that funds it will learn to bite its own tongue. A teacher who cannot afford to lose a room will eventually deserve it. A doctrine that cannot be spoken without checking a ledger will go on speaking, but only like a museum speaks, with labels, with light, with guards. I do not want a museum. I want a kitchen that cooks for the living and burns the fingers that refuse to learn. What then is the verdict? Not a program, a sentence that refuses anesthesia. Name the hands. Name the hands that build the halls, that wire the cameras, that sign the checks, that choose the themes, that bury the conflicts, that polish the bowl until you forget it is made of metal and labor. When the names are spoken, gratitude becomes heavy enough to change its form. It ceases to be posture and becomes peril, the peril of losing the kind of money that purchases silence. Only then does doctrine breathe like fire again. Oxygen meeting courage, not money meeting optics. I promised a line, and I will give it now, unadorned, so you have no excuse to miss it. If your truth must beg permission from wealth, it isn't truth, it's decor. I'm silent flame, light costs. Pay or stop calling it sacred.